Good evening, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to our Alumni Showcase Publications Showcase. My name is Dr. Miriam Nihan-Gray, and I'm currently the Director of Graduate Studies at Glucksman Ireland House, the Centre for the Study of Ireland and the Irish Diaspora at New York University. In the moment that we're in, unfortunately, we're not able to gather as often in person as we would like to. And a number of our alumni have published materials and research usually connected to work that they have done within the confines of our MA program. And we wanted to take an opportunity to kind of, have an opportunity to talk between ourselves and with a wider audience about the work that has evolved out of the research in our MA program and immediately following. So I'm going to shut up for the next hour and 15 minutes or so, something my husband says I don't do often enough at all. And I'm going to hand over to my colleague, Caroline Hafey, who Caroline is an alum of our program, and she's currently pursuing her PhD on a topic not unrelated to what she did with us at NYU, and is someone who remains very connected to our community. So we're very grateful to Caroline for agreeing to moderate the discussion today. She's going to help with the introductions to our speakers. And in about 70 minutes time or so, we will then move into an MA open house for anyone who wants to stay on the call. I'll be on, at least I'll be there, and my colleague Kelly Sullivan, I think, is going to stay on with me, and maybe our director, Professor Kevin Kenny, may be able to stay on. If anyone is interested in our MA program and would like to find out more about it. We are doing this in a webinar format. So our format for today will be through the chat function or the Q&A function at the bottom of your Zoom webinar. We will have another open house, which will be a more meeting communal format in about a month or so's time. And we're always available. I'm certainly available, and my colleagues are, in terms of follow-up or questions that you may have. So without further ado, I will hand over to you, Caroline, and thank you again for agreeing to moderate this evening, and always great to see you. Thank you so much.
Thanks so much, Miriam. It's great to be here virtually and to see all of your faces. As Miriam said, my name is Caroline Hafey. I graduated from the MA in Irish and Irish American Studies at Glucksman Ireland House, NYU in 2016. So a few years ago now. As she said, I'm now working on a PhD in English at the University of Massachusetts in Amherst. And I also chaired the alumni committee for Glucksman Ireland House, NYU. So I'm delighted to be here, and I'm delighted to be with some of the alumni community this evening. So what I thought we might do is just to kind of go through, if panelists could introduce themselves, your relationship to Ireland House, maybe how you came to be interested to do the master's, and if you could speak a little bit about your research projects that ultimately led to publication. I think that could be really great. And then what we might do is kind of open it up a little bit later for kind of a general discussion about research in the times of pandemic, the field of Irish studies more generally, and just kind of what you're working on now, or what you're hoping to work on moving forward. So without further ado, if I could turn it over to Ted Smith to speak about his project and most recent research.
Thanks so much, Caroline. Hello, everybody out there, and delighted to be on this panel, and with such a distinguished group of fellow panelists. Quite alarming in some ways that I have to speak alongside you guys. But anybody who's thinking about doing a master's in Irish Studies at NYU, really do it. You know, it's a fabulous opportunity. It's a transformative experience. I had reached the age of 65, which I know for many of you, it goes back to the First World War. And I realized I needed to do something else, get ready for the next chapter. I needed a sort of intellectual wake up when I retired from the corporate world, and looked around and finally came on this. I knew about Glucksman Ireland House, obviously, for some time, and had attended the public lectures, and I knew of the high quality reputation it has in terms of teaching and just stimulation. So, that was my background. I approached Dr. Miriam Nine-Gray, who was just fabulous in terms of taking me through the various steps that, if you're not used to the university environment, hadn't been involved in it since I graduated from Trinity College Dublin in 1972. A lot of things had changed, including computers and spreadsheets and various other odd things. The Chicago Manual of Style was still around to torment us, but I guess it provides some sort of detail. So, I graduated it in 1918. This was part of my thesis appeared in the winter 2020 Journal of American Ethnic History. And that's a very interesting journal. In the same paper, Luke Ritter had written something on heightened crime and the economic origins of political nativism in the antebellum West. Somebody else wrote about, with the utmost practical speed, Eisenhower, Hungarian paralleles, and the hidden hand behind US immigration and refugee policy in 1956-57. And lots of books reviewed on managing migrations, farm workers, almost citizens, Puerto Rico, Fight the Power, African Americans, and a long history of police brutality in New York City. So it was a fabulous experience, and I'm really grateful that part of my thesis got published there. By quick background to before the thesis, I'm sure this has been explained to you by Dr. Nine-Gray, but you have this opportunity of fabulous courses and great choice. And one of the first ones I did was the Irish and Jewish migration with Professors Marion Casey and Professor Hasia Diner. And that was, multidisciplinary, comparative, amazing to have two powerhouses, professors in the room in the seminar with you to do that study. And I really loved that, and wrote a paper called Wars and Conflict in the Homelands, comparing the Jewish and Irish identities in America in 1966 to 76 and how they differed in their responses. Actually, later then with Marion Casey, we had a course in resurrecting the ethnic village. And thank God, Kellyanne Reynolds was in that course. She was our computer whiz and genius as we tried to navigate spreadsheets and Ancestry Library and into, I mean, if you're looking for this MA to teach you new computer skills, it will, provided you have Kellyanne beside you. You just got to mix up the folks beside you. And, it was, any of you whose great grandparents, whatever, came from Ireland, you'll probably find the boat in which they came as part of this study. If you go into the data, it's fascinating. The whole life comes alive. One of the papers I did was on Charles Francis Murphy, who grew up in the gas house tenement and became head of Tammany Hall. And of course, Tammany Hall went from corruption to the New Deal, from Boss Croker to James Farley, Al Smith and FDR, child labor laws, factory safety after the Triangle Shirtwaist Factory fire in 1911. So a lot of connections are made with New York, America, and Ireland. And another thing we studied was the mid-19th century exodus from a Kerry village, Castle Gregory, and a lot of the records in the New York Immigrant Savings Bank. Another course was taught by Kelly Sullivan on the Big House. That's a fabulous course, so much fun. And I know Caroline joined us as a sort of senior figure, already doing great work on Dorothy. Dorothy McArdle. So that introduced you to another section of Irish life. The Big House is elegiac trope, deeply ironic sense of subversion of the imperial notion, the stranded gentry, delicious writers like Molly Keane and Elizabeth Bone, Mariah Edgeworth, just fabulous, even up to Beckett's Watt. He based that book, as many of you know, on the Beckett family house in Fox Rock in Dublin, Glencairn, which was the home of Boss Croker for a period, going full circle back to Tammany Hall, as we tried to make connections around the place. So that was some of the background. Lots of other courses I did, but I don't want to take up the time here as time is marching on. So my thesis emerged from some of this, 20,000 words or whatever. God bless Professor Casey. She went through this, as she will, as supervisor of my thesis, with numerous edits. I mean, just fabulous edits, really helpful. Every page, careful writing, careful, just extraordinary work. I just, I'm in awe of what the care she took. As Joe Lee said afterwards, he was the director before Professor Kenny. He said, Jesus, Ted, I think there are 3 theses in this. You could have broken it down. So that was part of the thing that we've constantly got to try and do is, narrow down the piece of research, get as many primary sources as you can, make it as original as you can. And, but it's a wonderful intellectual exercise, being critical and so forth. And the chapters I had were the evolution of Irish America to the title was From Ethnic Controversy to Ethnic Confidence, Views in Ireland's American Diaspora from the 80s to the 21st century. And I had 2 great primary materials for that, an Irish Embassy confidential report from 1980 on Irish American organizations given to me by the then ambassador, Sean Donnan, who had it in his private papers. He handed it over to me one night over dinner in Dublin, said, you might be interested in this. I told Professor Casey about this, and then she found for me an interesting complementary report, which is a confidential Sinn Féin report on Irish American organizations later in the 80s. And so I was able to compare the 2 of them. And that became the basis for my journal submission. The Sinn Féin report was a real knock job on NORAID at the time by Sinn Féin, by Jerry Adams and his folks. And it's a fascinating document. It hasn't really been properly published yet. Pat Mullen, one of the IRA Brooklyn 5, tried for gun running in Brooklyn by the US attorney. He and Michael Flannery were caught with guns, but the jury found them not guilty. The defense was they had been working with an FBI informant who informed on them. And then it turned out he'd worked for the CIA for a period. So the defense was, we thought we were working for the CIA, getting these guns over to Ireland. And the jury anyway found for them, and they got off, much to the annoyance of the British tabloid press, which went nuts. So Professor Kenny then appears and he follows up as well. He says, there's a lot of interesting stuff here, but yeah, do you want to try and bring it down a bit if you're going to get it published? And he gave me a number of options, and I picked one, which was to go with the 2 confidential surveys, because we'd also done a survey of Irish Americans with Irish Central in 2017, which was full of interesting data as well. That's for another time. And one of the great tips that I received, amongst many, I better get on with this soon, was Professor Kenny said, analyze each of your paragraphs with a sentence or 1 or 2 words, and number them all, and go down through them. And then if it doesn't have an obvious title, ask yourself why. And then does the fit right? And because one of the biggest things you have to do is get rid of filler. As you all know, when you're researching, you just, lots of stuff, and then you don't want to, I got all this stuff, I got to use it. So you jam it in, but it doesn't necessarily add to the flow. And so I find this is brilliant, recommended to anyone. Just then you have your paragraphs. It doesn't seem like 8,000 words all going around in your head. And it has a certain clarity to it. And it was then you'll find, okay, paragraph 11 really should be in 22 and 20 should be over here. And I'd never been told that before. So I think it should be called, the Kenny trick or something in his honor, and would be wonderful. So I think I'll wrap it up there. We can follow up with other questions, but just want to thank very much all the faculty, and indeed Dr. Gray and Caroline was in the administration at the time, also helped me through these incredible journalistic gymnastics and computer gymnastics, so we had to do. So with that, I look forward to hearing the rest of you, and back to you, Caroline.
Thank you so much, Ted. No, that was great and such fascinating. It's so nice to hear the journey of, you know, how a publication can really start with one paper in one class and then really just progress forward with the right nurturing and with the right attention and crafting. So that's wonderful. Thank you. I think next we'll hear from Mary Elizabeth. If I could turn it over to you. Thanks.
Sure. Hi. So I'm Mary Elizabeth. I'm a graduate of the class of 2019 from Glucksman. And I am currently a first-year PhD student in history at Fordham, continuing with the work that I started at Glucksman, so very excited. Like Ted said, it's been a real journey in narrowing some of this work down and kind of choosing a focus, and I'm still working through that, but it's been very exciting. So I found my way to Glucksman really because I found an interest in Irish studies during my undergrad career, and I was looking for a way to continue that. And what I really liked about Glucksman was that it was a really immersive and multifaceted program, kind of a real interdisciplinary experience. I didn't have to choose between literature or history or language right away. I got to kind of indulge in all of those different sides of Irish studies. It was so exciting. And I did my thesis in history ultimately, but I think it was just so special to do all of these different kinds of subjects and readings, and I really enjoyed the whole experience. But my research project began in a class of Marion Casey's as well. It was an Irish America course, post-colonial Irish America, and we were talking about the tour of Eamon de Valera of the United States, 1919, 1920, kind of the fundraising tour that he did. And I remember Marion pulled up the map from the Atlas of Irish History and was pointing out all the different places that he went. And there was a bunch of dots, on the south. And she was telling us, if someone wanted to look into that, I think that would be really interesting. And being from the south, I was like, I should look into that. And so I did. And that was my term paper for the course and wound up being my thesis. And then last year, I was able to publish just a little bit of that for the centenary of the tour. But it kind of has a few goals. I mean, like I said, it's been kind of a journey in narrowing down all the different things I want to talk about. But the thesis really talked about, the Southern experience of de Valera and his team, sort of, the people he met with, the people he worked with, the reactions to him there, kind of examines each stop. And then it really talks about how I think the tour was a real political education for him, for de Valera, and how he really kind of learned to perform as a politician in the South. Sorry, there's just so many things I want to go over. But it also, I think, tells a lot about the social conditions of the South. So it became more also an examination of Irish America and the American South, as well as sort of Irish politics at the time. And I think it also kind of shows that, there really was an active Irish community in the South, working for the cause. We think of Irish America, we think of New York, we think of Boston, Philadelphia, Chicago, and you don't often think of New Orleans or Charlotte or Birmingham. And I think that these actually really stood out as hubs for Irish America for the cause. And it was really exciting to kind of delve into that and look into the local actors who were making moves, and it's really exciting. But the publication really came from kind of connections and collaborations that came out of my time at Glucksman. I was really lucky to attend and speak at the ACES South Conference, and I think that was 2019. And just kind of coincidence, Joe Kelly, who is the director of Irish Studies at the College of Charleston, attended the panel I spoke on. And then when he was approached the next year to work on the centenary events for this tour of the South with the Consul General in Atlanta, he remembered my work and brought me in, and it was really, really fun to sort of help them go over, what happened in the South and what De Valera did and what he saw and what he said even, who he worked with. And so it kind of spiraled from there, and I was able to work with posts in Atlanta, Charleston, Charlotte, and New Orleans. And the Charlotte work was planned actually to be a talk, a spoken event, but due to COVID, we actually channeled it into this article that was published last spring. And so it really delved into the visit in Charlotte, North Carolina, which is actually my hometown. So it was really special to write that, and sort of the reaction to him there and the organization that went on in Charlotte and sort of the local events that went on during the time. And so that is the work I did. And I think ultimately, working at a time like this in the field that we do, it's all about flexibility and maintaining that kind of, it's a tough time. But I think that this experience really solidified, my goals. And I really owe so much to the experiences at Glucksman and all my fellow classmates who are here. So yeah, it was a joy. Thanks, guys.
Awesome. Thank you, Mary Elizabeth. I love kind of hearing, well, the passion that you have for your research and that I think everybody here has, but it's so lovely to hear that, even despite the pandemic, a kind of happy thing came out of it in resulting in this publication, right? So yeah, it's kind of a nice silver lining to take away from an otherwise challenging time. So yes, thank you. I think next we will move to Elizabeth Hodges, if you want to take over from here.
Hi, thanks, Caroline. And I find, Ted and Mary Elizabeth a hard act to follow because both your research is just so cool. But a little bit about me before I start gushing on their research. So my name is Elizabeth Hodges, and I am a senior genealogy librarian at the Allen County Public Library in Fort Wayne, Indiana, which for those who might be thinking, okay, Fort Wayne, Indiana, why did you move from New York to Indiana? There's a reason. The library I work in is currently the second largest genealogy library in the country. It is the largest public collection in the country. So it's really cool. And how I ended up working there really kind of started with my research project. So I got interested in Irish studies a little bit in my undergrad, and I had a professor who suggested that I apply for the program. I had no idea at the time that I would get into things like genealogy, really, not in depth, not like my aunt who's been doing it for a decade. But, after I took, a class with Miriam, so my first semester I took debates in modern Irish history. I got more into modern Irish history because before, I was a history major as an undergrad. I was more interested in the early modern period, but that semester I took Miriam's class, but I also took an Atlantic, Irish in the Atlantic world class. And it's not that I didn't enjoy that class, but I just started getting fascinated in the social history aspect of the modern period. And then the following semester, so this would have been spring of 2018, I believe, Miriam suggested that I, do an independent study, and because I was getting interested in like women's history, with like where do women fit into this bigger picture, especially of activism in the United States. So she had been doing a lot of work on Dr. Gertrude B. Kelly, and there was a woman whose name kept coming up over and over again. Her name is Mrs. Marguerite Moore. No one knew anything about this woman. I mean, a lot of the secondary research I read just kind of mentioned her in a sentence, not much more than that. She was often described showing up at these public speaking events because she was a really great orator. she was often described as this old woman, right? This elderly woman, which I don't think she was that elderly when she was doing a lot of this stuff. Well, not by our standards, at least. But not much was known about her personal life, who she was, what organization she was into. So I kind of started this project that would become my thesis project in the spring of 2018. And very slowly, this woman became my white whale. And trying to piece together this woman's life, because I was very much interested in how did her environment affect her activism. And because her environment, the world she's living around, her family, where did she grow up? Where did she live? It all would change how she viewed the world, and how this woman viewed the world directly impacted what organization she was in. Who did she meet? And this was somebody who knew everybody, right? So when she was in Ireland, so this woman would have been born in 1846 in Waterford, and she became involved after she got married in the Ladies' Land League. And she knew the Parnell sisters very well, went to prison in 1882 for attempting to excite discontent in the minds of Her Majesty's subjects, which is the coolest crime ever in my mind. So she goes to jail for a little while, and she gets out. And fast forward to 1884, she leaves Ireland and moves to New York. And she moves with all of her children, aside from one who had passed away shortly before she had left. I was able to kind of piece together some of her family story, but there's a lot that is still blank. But doing that research for Irish genealogy is really hard for that time period because of the lack of records. So it was kind of a good exercise for me. But once this woman immigrated, she didn't just live this quiet life. She got involved in all kinds of stuff. She became involved in the suffrage movement. She was a part of a protest when the Statue of Liberty was unveiled, of suffragist women who got into basically a cattle barge and sailed around the Statue of Liberty protesting, saying that this was a farce and that it was a great pageant. Because how can you have at the entrance, the gates to the country, so to speak, a woman be the figure of liberty when women were not free? So she was into stuff like that. She still campaigned for the rights of the poor, the rights of tenants. And she was also involved in Irish nationalism in the United States. And her kind of, her ideology with that, it evolves and changes over time. She was someone who was at one point not so interested in physical force stuff, but then was like, no, I do agree with the physical force nationalist stuff. So it all kind of evolves, but the amount of people this woman knew, I mean, she was in an organization with Susan B. Anthony. She met Grover Cleveland in 1888, I believe, gave him kind of a snide remark about Ireland, which is really hysterical. But she was somebody who was very much forgotten in time. And I honestly think it's because she's a woman. And two, she outlived everybody. I mean, she lived to be quite elderly. So she outlived everyone. So that was kind of my thesis, right? And how I ended up turning it into an article, which was published in the New York Irish History Roundtable, which Marguerite Moore was on the cover, which makes me so happy. Not because it's, it's my article, but because it's Marguerite Moore. I was put in contact by Miriam with Frank Naughton, who is the editor. And they had first actually asked me to be on a panelist for it was about women in women of action. So it was Irish American women activists. Miriam was also on the panel talking about Gertrude Kelly. So I did a panel for them, and they also asked me to write a journal article about Marguerite. So I basically took my thesis and tried to condense it as much as possible. It was a painful process that Miriam helped me with a lot, and I don't even have words to thank Miriam for dealing with my excessive emails and text messages saying, help me. But yeah. I think that's it. I rambled a little.
Not rambling, all great things. Thank you, Elizabeth. And I think, you've really spoken to how observing an activist as a figure can in and of itself be a form of activism, right? And campaigning for her story and preserving it. And then also, yeah, just the wonderful support to then bring that research out into the world and to present it, and the support that Ireland House can give in that process. So thank you. That's wonderful. I think we will move then to Kellyanne. Turn it over to you.
Hi, I'm Kellyanne Reynolds. Three of the four people here were my classmates at Glucksman, so it's really nice to see them. So I graduated in the class of 2019, and my story is, in finding my research topic, is very similar to Mary Elizabeth's, where it was a throwaway statement by Dr. Marion Casey in class while we were going through the Atlas of the Irish Revolution. And it kind of just like, I was like, okay, I'm gonna read about that. But before that, in finding Glucksman Ireland House, I honestly can't remember, even though it was literally not that long ago, but I was a history major in college, and I was not on the path to Irish studies. I was on the path for genocide studies, and then genocide studies got to be a little bit too much, and I took a class on modern Ireland, and it was so fascinating. And having Irish ancestry, I didn't really know anything about Ireland beyond the famine, which is common for a lot of Irish Americans and whose family came over in the late 1800s. And so then I became hooked, but then I went further back and I became like a Tudor freak, where I was obsessed with learning about Tudor Ireland. And then when I started at Glucksman, what made me want to apply was, when I was coming to graduate, I didn't quite feel like my journey as a student was over. And I hadn't learned as much as I wanted to learn. And so I kind of applied on a whim, and like really late in the game, I applied in April, and like the deadline was in April. And then I started in September or August, and I took classes with Dr. Marion Casey and Dr. Miriam Gray my first semester. And I ended up writing 2 papers, one for each of them, that were connected. For Dr. Casey's class, I wrote about the Irish American side, and for Dr. Gray's class, for Miriam's class, I wrote about the Irish side. So I was focused on this Irish relief initiative in the War of Independence in 1920, 1921. And so for Dr. Gray, I was writing about the Irish White Cross, and for Dr. Casey, I was writing about the American Committee for Relief in Ireland. And I was kind of focusing on specifically 2 figures. For the Irish side, it was this Irish Quaker, James Douglas. And for the American side, I focused on this American who had no connections to Ireland, which I found quite odd. And he was the head delegate for the relief initiative that traveled to Ireland in January 1921. And I wanted to figure out why. Why did he get involved? And what would have drove him to care about Ireland? And I couldn't quite figure it out, because there were these 8 Americans, half of them were Quakers, half of them, the other half were Unitarians, and I couldn't quite figure it out. It still was so random, even after being in the archives. And then it came to the next semester where I had figured out this was going to be my thesis. I had tackled it from 2 different sides already, and I still was missing that last piece. And then Marion was like, well, what do you need to take it to that next level of understanding? Like, what topic would further enhance your research? And I was like, this one figure, Dr. Maloney. And I was using his papers at the New York Public Library, and he wasn't really someone people talked about. He was kind of a footnote here or there, similar to Elizabeth's research. And I was like, he's the key. He's the missing component to all of these things I'm reading about and writing about. And so she was like, that's it. That's your next thing. So I spent the next semester and then the summer researching Dr. Maloney, and he became my thesis. And my obsession forever, I know everything about him. And, but, you know, it was it was a journey to get there. But once I figured that one little bit out, it wasn't until I studied abroad in the summer with Elizabeth and Mary Elizabeth in Dublin that the pieces really fell into place. And I did that through the NYU summer program. And we had such a unique experience, the three of us, because we were collaborating in our archival studies, which is a rare thing, I think, in the world of history. We would come at the end of the day and swap documents and be like, oh, I found something that relates to your thesis, and oh, I found something that relates to yours. And we would share all these documents. And it was kind of this really nice, almost group effort. And so anyway, that was the journey. So basically, I wrote an article for Century Ireland and RTE about Maloney. And it was basically cut and pasted and edited down from my thesis. And it was just a bio, part of their Global Irish Revolution series and their Global Lives. And so Dr. Maloney was a Scottish neurologist, random, but he was of Irish descent and he was based in New York City. And he does seem random. What's a Scottish neurologist doing in the Irish Revolution? He became a progressive activist in American circles, and he was connected with a lot of Irish progressives. And then after World War I, which he fought in, he became very disillusioned with the British Empire and their war. And he, after the Easter Rising, he became very pro-Irish nationalism and pro-Irish independence. And so he got involved and he kept making these connections. And then he brought in American progressives and like the liberal elite in the United States into the Irish circle. And I wrote about that and sort of how he tried to constantly make the Irish cause sort of palatable for the rest of the world, make it so they could understand what they were going through. And it wasn't just like an ethno-racial, like nationalist issue. It was like a global thing that they should care about. And he always phrased it in that way, in this global context. And he was constantly trying to raise awareness in Europe and across the United States to raise money. And he was connected with De Valera, Boland, but he was the closest with Joseph McGarity and Patrick McCartan. But one of the fun things about studying Maloney was that he literally, there wasn't a single topic that my research on him didn't touch. Because he was a doctor, I was doing medical research. I was reading medical papers from like 1912. And then when the pandemic hit, I was like, there's going to be a second wave. Because in 1918, Maloney wrote a letter to Patrick McCartan talking about how there's going to be a second wave. And so I was just like, Maloney, you know, he like predicted it 100 years ago. So, you know, it was like one of those things where being able to have the opportunity to do this research and engage in this like sort of expansive study of history where what I wrote was original and it was research that no other scholar had done. It was just so rewarding, both like emotionally and like intellectually. And I wouldn't have been able to do that without the resources at Glucksman, without the connections in New York, without the ability to study in Dublin. That was life-changing in terms of my archival research. And I wouldn't have been able to do that without Glucksman and without my professors and my classmates, and especially Dr. Casey, who really had to deal with a lot because she was grading mine and Mary Elizabeth at the same time. And I, like Ted, I'm a very wordy writer. Dr. Casey had to cut out like 70 pages from my thesis. So, you know, it was such a supportive environment, and it introduced me to the person who asked me to, Dr. Sarah Gannon, who asked me to write the bio for Dr. Maloney. So I wouldn't have ever had that if it hadn't been for Glucksman. So.
Awesome. Thank you, Kellyanne. One of the trends that I'm hearing across all of these different narratives and these different kind of stories of exigence with your projects is these kind of footnote figures, right? These footnote figures that cause us pause. You know, why don't we know more about this person who's operating in these sort of incredible circles? And then the amazing research and projects that can come out of just that one footnote, right? So yeah, lovely. And thinking too about, you know, New York as a site of research and as a site of intersection for all of these different narratives. I think that's going to be a theme that is particularly relevant for Joe Long, who I will turn it over to round us out on this panel. I think you might be muted, Joe. Hang on.
Joe, you're on mute.
Can you hear me now?
Yeah.
Sorry about that, guys. Can you see me? Hello.
Yeah, we can see you and hear you.
All right. So you just had 4 very smart people, and now you got the street guy. So a little bit about my background. 2007, I guess, 2008, I got an email from Glucksman saying that they were going to offer a master's in Irish American Studies. I went down to see John Waters, who was running the master program at the time. I convinced John to give me a chance. Excuse me, I'm right on First Avenue, so that you're hearing street noise. So I got John to allow me in the program, and I think I was the first person accepted into it. I was 55 years of age at the time, had no clue whether I could do the work or not. But I still worked for Otis Elevator, and at the time, Otis was part of the United Technologies Corporation, and they allowed anybody to go to school for anything they wanted to go for, and they paid for it. So I went to the HR department, and they told me yes. So I went down and I got in the program. So during the course of it, so I got 2 pieces here that I'm going to have to go quick. So the bottom line is I grew up on the Lower West Side of Manhattan in the Chelsea section. My parents came from Ireland, from the same town that Miriam's parents now live in Arklow, seacoast town below Dublin. My parents came over during the Depression. My father and my uncles, on both sides, they all worked on the docks because the Irish controlled the waterfront. So during the course of my studies in at NYU, both Waters and Marion Casey both told me, listen, you're talking so much about the West Side, you need to write your thesis on it. I tried to find a way, a connive way to not do it, but they both said, no, you have to do it to get out. So I did write my thesis on the Chelsea section, as I said, and the far west side of the village. So because the further west you went towards the Hudson River, the more Irish it became, because as I mentioned, the Irish controlled the waterfront. So quite a few of the men working on the docks were of Irish American or even Irish descent. So that in turn, I did the thesis, and then as Elizabeth mentioned earlier, Frank Norton came to me and asked if he could publish my thesis over 2 years in the New York Irish Roundtable, which I was shocked at, being I was this. I don't consider myself a real academic. I was more of a street guy. I was knocked out by it, and I was more than happy to have it published. It was a thrill. To this day, I still get people from the old neighborhood calling me up asking for copies of it. So that basically was the thesis that I was there for. So then there's this secondary piece of it. So when I first went down to see John Waters, I found out that he was more literature inclined than, say, history. And I asked him if he had ever heard of a guy named John Connolly. And he said, no, he had never had. So I said, why don't you Google him while we're here? And so he saw that John Connolly was this Irish crime writer based in Dublin. And I told him that I'm very close friends with John. So Connolly started writing mysteries in 1999, and he came over to sign his first book, and that's where I first met him in '99 here in the city, and then we became very close friends. And Connolly was like a Pied Piper for Irish crime fiction. It had been in, I don't want to call it doldrums, but it was a quiet writing period, if you will, that was going on in Ireland. And I was a big mystery buff, and I was a collector of mysteries. I was a long-term mystery reader since going back to my childhood days. And I was always dying for mysteries out of Ireland if there was anybody writing. John's mysteries do not take in Ireland. They're all about here in the States. But he was the Pied Piper. He opened up the doors for other people in Ireland to start to consider writing crime fiction. And people like Declan Burke, Declan Hughes, Brian McGilloway, Stuart Neville, and then two females that I remember, which was Arlene Hunt and Alex Barkley. And we ended up having a seminar, a full-day seminar that we flew over, 6 of the writers to the Ireland House. And we did a one-day event, which everybody thought was great, blah, blah, blah. And it was thrilled because NYU beat Trinity College, if you will, at the time, to recognizing the fact that they had great writing coming out under the genre of crime fiction. So from that, years go on, and about 3 years ago, I was reached out to by two editors, Liz Mannion and Brian Cliff, reached out to me about a book that they were going to do on Irish crime fiction called Guilt Rules All. Let me just pull it up to show. So Guilt Rules All. So there's 17 chapters in the book, and one of the chapters I wrote with their editing. And I wrote an article about a young woman named Arlene Hunt, who I had gotten to meet through John Connolly. And I was asked to just concentrate on 5 of her earlier novels, which was a crime team working together, Private Eyes and a male, female. And so I wrote this article, and I found it, I was well rewarded. It was rewarding to me because I didn't see much crime writing at the time coming out of the females in Ireland back in the, if you will, the early 2000s or whatever. And Arlene took a chance, her and another writer who's in the book, Alex Barkley. And quite honestly, I think Arlene and Alex taking that chance have opened up the doors to so many other female writers where they have eclipsed the crime fiction genre in Ireland. Men right now are like a second thought, with the exception of John. John Connolly is still a major player in the crime writing field. So I know the time is short, so I didn't want to dwell too much because I got 2 different areas that I was kind of focused on. So that's where it's at the moment in terms of, I guess you got questions coming up.
Awesome. Thank you, Joe. It's actually great to hear the ways in which, one project can kind of lead on to another, right? And result in multiple publications with, just more time and energy devoted to the subject. We do have some questions, so I did want to make sure that we just make some time to make sure that we answer those. It was asked whether folks could ever audit courses, and Miriam's replied that courses can indeed be audited, but one can enroll for a non-matriculating student. So if folks are ever interested in just kind of sitting in and auditing a course, that is a possibility. We have a request already for a copy of Joe's first publication and probably the second as well. And yes, recommendation for Lisa McKierney's Glorious Heresies is great. If there are any other questions, folks can feel free to add them into the chat, and we can, I think we do still have a couple minutes. Is that right, Miriam?
Yeah. Caroline, could we take the opportunity? Thank you It's such a treat. I'm getting text messages from Marion here where, and I'm sure Kelly and Kevin are on here. We feel so happy to hear your kind of journeys through the program and your research. And you know, it's so exciting for us to see the sense of community that the place builds in terms of like sharing information and sources and getting excited about people's projects in terms of, you know, knowing, if I ever come across anything to do with Dr. Maloney, I'm on to Kellyanne saying, Kellyanne, do you know, blah, blah, blah. More often than not, Kellyanne knows bloody well everything, but it's just like really nice to see that, how we kind of get invested in projects and to hear about that sense of community and collaboration. But before we see if there are any more questions from the audience, Caroline, will you tell us a little bit about what you're working on now and how it relates to what you did at Glucksman Ireland House with us as well?
Sure, I can do that. Yeah, so like I said, I did the master's in Glucksman Ireland House. I finished up in 2016. I had come into the program also having done a minor in Irish studies. So when I was an undergraduate, I came across a figure called Dorothy McArdle, and I just sort of got hooked on her. She was another footnote figure, someone who I felt I wanted to know more about, and none of her writing at that time was really available. All of the works that I was trying to get my hands on were either out of print, that I was, rummaging through used bookstores to try to find, and used bookstores online. But yeah, there was not a lot of information about her out in the world. And so I kind of thought, well, I'd still like to know more, even if it's going to be challenging to find that information. And Glucksman Ireland House immediately was the site that I felt would be the right place to kind of bring that passion for the subject. And I was lucky enough to meet Dr. Kelly Sullivan, who is here, who supervised my thesis on the prison writings of Dorothy McArdle. And I was actually able to meet with her a couple of times. We were both in Dublin in the summer. And so through the summer in Dublin program, I was able to access the archives in Ireland, which was really integral in doing that thesis. I really wouldn't have been able to kind of produce a document or understand much about her at that stage without having had access to the archives. And then of course, without having Kelly's guidance in working through that material. From there, I ultimately finished the thesis and still was not done with McArdle. So I wanted to kind of look into recognizing some of her other work. So my thesis focused on her prison writings, and there was a growing energy around McArdle at the time. So there were Tramp Press in particular in Dublin had put 2 of her books into reprint, so into republication through their Recovered Voices series. And after kind of connecting with them again through the ability to go to Ireland through Glucksman House and make those connections with Lisa and Sarah, ultimately it resulted in them asking me to write the introduction for a third of her novels to be reprinted and republished in the Recovered Voices series. So that Dark Enchantment by Dorothy McArdle with my introduction came out last November, and we launched it at Ireland House just before the world shut down. So that was a really happy occasion for me, and one that I'm really grateful for. But again, none of these projects that I've done could have happened, in my opinion, without the support and the guidance that I found at Glucksman Ireland House. I'm also, now I'm doing a PhD, and I feel wholeheartedly grateful for the training that I received interdisciplinarily, both in history and in literature, in setting me up to do this next degree. So Yeah, I can't sing praises enough, but I do see Kevin raising his hand, so I'm gonna let him ask a question or make a comment.
Yeah, thank you. I'll just make a quick comment. It's been great to listen to everybody, especially because I'm still relatively new here. I didn't have a chance to teach any of you. A couple of things that really struck me, what Kellyanne said about the collaborative nature of the program. It's, I think, really distinctive to Ireland House. You can get completely lost in an MA program at a big university, and we're pretty much the opposite of that, because of the community and because it's interdisciplinary. And then part of that is the range of background in the students that we have from every walk of life and different career stages. And it's a particular synergy that's produced that way. One other thing I wanted to mention, and Ted Smith touched on this in his presentation, and it's, you know, so you write a thesis and then the next thing is, how do I publish it? And this is a panel about publishing as well as writing about a thesis. There's a thing, you know, called the reporter's notebook syndrome, where you've collected everything and you therefore feel obliged to inflict it on your reader. Your reader needs to know. Try reading a long article in the New York Times and you know what I mean. So when I'm teaching, I often distinguish between three things. One is having a topic. The second is having a thesis, and the third is making an argument. And I just want to very briefly make that distinction. So we all have a topic, and we're all convinced that it's the most important and interesting topic in the world, obviously, right? Because we've done all this research and we love it. The trick is how we're going to persuade our reader that it's important and interesting. To do that, you need a thesis. You need to make a claim about that topic. So you need to be making some kind of original claim, a claim that will probably surprise your reader a little bit and make your reader say, really? Is that really so? And then your argument substantiates the thesis. So I like to think of it in those terms, that you have a topic that's rich and fascinating by definition. Your task is to make it rich and fascinating to other people. And you can do that by making a claim, by having a thesis, and then you lay it out in an argument. So that's just my own take as I'm listening to getting from thesis to publication. So thank you all so much. Didn't mean to kill off the conversation.
No. Thanks for that, Kevin. No, that was great, and really always very helpful advice in terms of structure, which anyone who's worked closely with Kevin on projects knows that he's a pro at that stuff. So, and just to mention, folks, you know, we showcased, you know, 5 of our students here this evening. You know, we have some more recent publications. We obviously this evening's event could only be but so long, and there were some conflicts. And you know, this is actually a really nice format that we'll revisit again. For example, Maureen Brady recently published a piece drawing from her research for her thesis as well on the roots of the Rose of Tralee festival, which anyone familiar with Irish culture knows that every August at least Kerry is taken over by this very important festival that has a kind of world reach in terms of its diasporic connections, etc., etc. And Kelly Sullivan, our colleague here who's on, was reminding me the other day that Ruby Gavin Harris and Daphne Dyer-Wolf both have articles in the most recent issue of Éire Ireland, one of the leading Irish studies publications, actually edited by Kelly and our colleague Nick Wolfe as well. So this is not an exhaustive list, and the people I've mentioned there today, there are more publications out there, but we wanted to give people a kind of a sense of some of the work that is being done and has been done out of Glucksman Ireland House, and to also give a shout out because Joe very nicely set up there what he had done in his project in terms of oral histories, and the oral history project on the Chelsea area of New York City, and then moved into his interest in Irish crime fiction, and how John Connolly has been a Pied Piper, but Joe Long has been a Pied Piper in terms of connections and kind of making those introductions and entrees for us in a transatlantic space as well. And the chapter that Joe wrote in Guilt Rules All, we'll actually have an event next month at Glucksman Ireland House with the editors of that volume, Beth Mannion, who I think might be on this evening with us, and Brian Cliff. So do check out that event if you're interested. It's a great follow-on to some earlier collections rather, on Irish crime fiction. Ken Fauerbach is in the audience and has asked a question there. There is a rich literature component to the program, and can Professor Sullivan please describe that for the audience? Thank you for that, Ken, because we're kind of gone, we went very history there. And if we don't mind us putting you on the spot, Kelly, maybe you could talk a little bit actually maybe about some of those recent projects or whatever you think yourself. Thank you, and thanks, Ken, for that question.
Yeah, thank you, Ken, for that question. Yeah, I'm happy to try to cover some of talk about some of the many classes we offer in literature. And I would also note that I've had many of the panelists in my classes, even though some of you ended up writing history thesis projects. We have a very interdisciplinary program, so there's a lot of overlap. The two primary literature courses that we offer are called Literature of Modern Ireland 1 and 2. And usually my colleague John Waters and I, he teaches 1 and I teach 2. And we cover literature from, his course begins very early and covers literature from roughly, I think, the 16th and 17th centuries up through about 1850. And then I take over from there and do 19th century literature up through the present. So we cover a huge range with those two survey courses as a kind of beginning or a basis. And a lot of students who end up doing history projects take those classes as well. I think there's a lot of, there's a history and a cultural component to those classes. And then we teach different elective courses each semester. Most recently, I developed a new class that I hope to teach again in the future, but on Ireland and the environment. Again, it was a kind of interdisciplinary course, but the major focus was on literature and in a small part on visual arts as well. And we read literature from the, again, kind of a range, but primarily the 19th and 20th and 21st centuries, with a real focus on things like the Anthropocene, climate change, animal studies, the non-human. And we talked about the way Irish literature and Irish culture has responded to the environment, both historically and in the present in relation to questions around the climate primarily. So that was a fun and challenging class in lots of ways, not least of all because we had to kind of confront a lot of things that are happening in our world right now. And I also teach a poetry class, usually a class on Yeats and afterwards. So we start with Yeats, but we primarily focus on later 20th century Irish poets and move up through the contemporary moment. I think John's been teaching a class on the Northern Irish Troubles and literature, and he also teaches a class, I believe, on the Irish Revival, although maybe he hasn't offered that at the graduate level recently. I've been teaching the Big House class sometimes as well, which is it's a really fun class. I haven't taught that in a couple of years, but we get to read a lot of wonderful Gothic literature in that course, and talk about the ascendancy class and their deeply satiric writing about themselves. Ken Fauerbach is reminding me of John's course also on Black Irish writing, and then he teaches a Joyce seminar quite often, and I've taught that as well, which is John usually teaches it as a summer course, so it's a really intensive reading of Joyce's Ulysses over 6 weeks. So if you're up for a challenge, that's a great class to take. And I mean, a lot of the, I think another interesting thing about this panel and what it reveals is that there are lots of different careers available to our graduates as well. It's really great to hear from Elizabeth, your job as a genealogy librarian. That's really wonderful and links so much to the program that we offer. And we have a lot of students who also go on to do PhDs. So I think some of the publications that come out of the program, thesis work that turns into publications is helpful with that as well. But it's also great to see that people are publishing, but not necessarily just for the just to do the PhD. It's great to hear, Joe, about both of your publications, and I'm looking forward to reading the book on Irish crime fiction too. So yeah, I don't know. I'm happy to answer other questions, but that's kind of a basic overview of what we do. And I guess I could just briefly talk about Ruby and Daphne's pieces. That it was a special issue of the journal Era Ireland, which I don't, I'm kind of on the, I'm like a editorial assistant. I'm an assistant editor, which basically means I'm trying not to be the editor, but get sucked in and get involved. But that honor goes to Nick Wolf and Vera Krailkamp right now. But I did guest edit a special issue on Ireland and the environment. And in fact, it was really interesting to see Ruby's piece go through the publication process, because she was in fact encouraged by Vera Krailkamp to submit to the special issue when she went to an MA conference at Boston College. So it wasn't because I said, oh, you should submit this to the journal, not by any means. Vera encouraged her. And then she came to me and said, hey, I've been thinking about turning part of my thesis into an article for this journal. And I said, oh, well, actually, I'm the editor of that special issue. But it went through the history and interdisciplinary side of the issue. So with my co-editor, so I wasn't involved at all in the peer review process as a blind peer review. Daphne's piece, I believe Daphne Dyer-Wolf also did an MA at Ireland House before I was teaching in the program, and has since gone on to do a PhD and finish that PhD at Drew. And her piece was a submission, I believe, it kind of came out of the research she did in her PhD, but was sort of a side project. It was some of that material that you have to cut out of the thesis that you take the red pen to, but it's in the reporter's notebook and you want to do something with it. So Daphne turned some extra material into an article that was linked to bog slides in Ireland. So yeah, that was a little bit about those two recent pieces. It's kind of my basic spiel on the literature side of things.
Thank you for that, Kelly, and thanks, Ken, for reminding us to delve into that. Thanks, Kelly. Caroline, had you your hand up there?
Yeah, if I could just add, as someone who's also kind of on the literature side of things, I have to say that I think just the nature of this panel is something so very unique to Glucksman Ireland House, in that there are so many master's students publishing. I think that, as a PhD student, we're often encouraged, by the time you defend, you should have one publication. And the fact that, so many of our students are leaving the program with a publication already under their belt, I think is really quite extraordinary, and just speaks to the level of encouragement that faculty and staff at Glucksman Ireland House give to the students to present their research, but then also to kind of take it a step further and work with it to revise for publication. So yeah, that was just my 2 cents from having left the house and thinking back on the experience, and just how unique it really is in that kind of encouragement. And Ted, I'll turn it over to you.
Thank you, and I fully agree with that. I'd also just like to add what a great entree the MA program is in, not just to the Irish and Irish American world, but to other conferences. The American Conference of Irish Studies, ACIS, is a fabulous venue for reading papers. And they have regional conferences. They also have their national conference. I went to the one in Cork a few years ago, and also to Boston, had the opportunity of reading to a group of people. And it's just a great organization with about 800 members who teach Irish studies across the United States, and I think Canada as well. So bear in mind that you're not just connecting into Irish studies, but to the whole global American studies, and also NYU is a fabulous resource. You have the Archives of Irish America in Bobst, and Bobst Library is just a joy, and I can't recommend that enough, as well as connections into the other departments in NYU. Professor Kenny and his colleagues are opening up connections even more with other departments and other studies for collaborative effort. And Dr. Nang's been working on the Black, Brown, and Green, which I presume you'll talk about later program, but I think it's a very interesting one, demonstrating the inclusiveness and plurality of the Irish and Irish American identity, something that's often been neglected in the past. Thank you.
Thank you for that, Ted. And apologies there. I have a very determined 8-year-old neighbor trying to get through to my son. So apologies for the phone calling there if it cut in. Listen, it was fabulous to gather our alumni together. Caroline, thank you for moderating so nicely. Thank you to Kevin and Kelly for being on, and Marion and some of our other colleagues are in the audience. Sorry, I'm a little bit slow off the mark in terms of this webinar format, but there was a nice turnout this evening for this. We will put it online. There were people in touch earlier who had conflicts, and we'll make it available on our YouTube channel for anyone who wants to tune in later. And we're looking towards the fall, and we're always excited to see how the makeup of the class will shake out in terms of there's always something new. This year, for example, we have our first father and son pair in the program, guys. You guys probably don't know that we have a great father and son team in the program. That's the first time that has happened, that we've had two relatives in at the same time. So there's always something to kind of make it new. And to Ted's point, in terms of because we're based in New York City at NYU, we attract a very diverse range of students, and it's absolutely one of our strengths for those of us who teach on the graduate program, that gathering people together in that room in 101 or virtually, as we have been doing on Zoom, no matter what our backgrounds are, our ages, or where we grew up, or whatever, that interest in the Irish experience in Ireland or in the diaspora kind of collapses everything down in some really intellectually exciting ways. And it's a real pleasure for us to be part of the program in that way. So I will take this opportunity again to thank all our speakers and to draw the Alumni Publications Showcase segment of the evening to a close. I will hang out here online for anyone who would like to have a chat about the MA Open House. And let me say on the record, folks, I can't wait for the big party at Ireland House when we reopen, and having a glass of wine. I'll buy you all a nice glass of wine at Ireland House when I can. Thank you for doing this evening, because we really, really appreciate it. So feel free to stay on, folks, and if not, I will hang out here for anyone who wants to chat a little bit about the master's program and the intricacies of the application process and what's involved. Thanks again.